Good morning. Today it is the 3rd, I believe, of August, and this is the second of the summer ollies. Starting in September, we're going back to every 2 weeks, and the first one in September, I believe, is on September 14th. As indicated, I want to talk about Israel, Gaza, all of that. And rather than going forward, I want to go backwards on that topic, namely talk about the situation in Gaza and West Bank just now, and then move backwards a little bit. The war with Hamas is now almost 3 years old. As you probably know, 70-odd thousand people have been killed out of the 2 million. And since the so-called peace, which is almost a year old, another 1,000 people minimally have lost their lives. The structure of Gaza as we speak is that Israel commands 60% of Gaza, which means that 2 million people, even if they lived somewhere else in Gaza, are now squeezed into 40% of the territory, mostly still living in tents. And the Israelis, as we speak, and there are discussions of peace and all of that, are building a concrete barrier along the yellow line that demarcates the 60% of Gaza that Israel now commands and separates it from the 40% which the Gazans are controlling. The idea has been for almost a year that there is now peace, but as I pointed out, there hardly is any peace. People are losing their lives. I think yesterday or the day before, 13 people in Gaza were killed by the Israeli forces. 2 were maybe Hamas people out of the 13. In any event, that's what Israel was aiming at. The rest were civilians, and it included, women and several children and so forth. There was also, more or less a day ago, a bombing of a building on the Palestinian side of Gaza, which presumably was targeting a weapons depot of Hamas. Turns out it wasn't weapons facility at all, but it was a facility that had the medical supplies for the remaining 2 or 3 hospitals that are still functioning in Gaza. President Trump, if you will recall, initiated the Board of Peace. And while they haven't been meeting in most of the last year, they're all of a sudden meeting and have been activated. The Board of Peace is, or at least President Trump is happy to report that the Board of Peace was talking to Hamas, and Hamas was willing to let go of its weapons. Presumptively, this armament was supposed to take place both on the Hamas-controlled Gazan part of Gaza, and it turns out that while Hamas agreed, though haven't done it yet, to get rid of its weapons, the Israelis have been unwilling to do likewise, that is to say, remove military forces along the yellow line. So that doesn't sound very promising in terms of what the Board of Peace can accomplish. nor is it very promising as to what is going to happen in the 40% that the Gazans now live on. You will recall President Trump had all kinds of notions, including building casinos and so forth. But at the moment, the description is that Gazans, including women and children, are continuing to get killed, that some infrastructure in the Palestinian-controlled part of Gaza is still being bombed, and the ceasefire has not, in fact, taken place. So the situation now, 3 years later, is quite dire in Gaza. And if I could turn quickly to the West Bank, you have a situation in the West Bank where the settlers are moving into one town after another that is Palestinian, small towns, taking over olive groves, squeezing the Palestinians into a smaller and smaller area, maybe at this point 25 or 30% of the territory. It's a little hard to tell. The settlers move into the small villages, tell the locals that they must leave. If they resist in any way, they might get shot or killed. The Israeli army is usually present. It doesn't mostly participate, but it also doesn't interfere and stop this. So when the idea arose that you needed a two-state solution, we are now at the point where a two-state solution is no viable option anymore, since the Israeli control of 60% of Gaza on the one hand, and the takeover of settlers in a larger and larger chunk of the West Bank makes it not only unreasonable, but not feasible to have a two-state solution. So if there's not going to be a two-state solution, if we're past that idea, even though both outside of Israel and inside of Israel, there's still a discussion of the two-state solution, then what kind of solution might there be down the line? Let me jump way ahead again before I turn back to earlier times. And that is, how does one imagine the residual Palestinians in both Gaza and the West Bank who can't possibly have a state anymore, even if they wanted to? How is this all going to work out in that part of the world and with Israel? People are beginning to imagine that you might have to have a single state with both Israelis and Palestinians, and the state would be one that would maybe resemble something like Switzerland, where you have, on the one hand, a central government, but on the other hand, you have areas controlled by various sub-states, sub-areas. And there are beginning to be thoughts both in Europe and elsewhere that if this conflict ever stops and people stop getting killed, we are now beyond a two-state solution, and we might have to think about a single state, probably dominated by Israel, but also having some autonomy to areas which are Palestinian controlled. That's not such an unusual image. As I said, you can look at Switzerland, you can look at some other countries that have central governments and then fairly autonomous regions in a single umbrella state. Whether this can come to be or whether it is in the cards, nobody can really say. Suffice it to say that it is totally unclear what the Board of Peace can possibly accomplish, because at some point, you can't put the genies back in the bottle. You're now having a large chunk of Gaza being not only controlled, but a concrete wall being built in Gaza. You have a not quite 2 million people who are Palestinians in Gaza squeezed into a little area. This is not the makings of a viable future state or chunk of a state. And by the time, the dust settles, imagining a Palestinian state, in which 2/3 or more are run by the settlers, Israeli settlers, that also doesn't work anymore. So I guess what I'm saying, much of the imagery that has been built up over the past 3 years since this conflict started is already outdated. And some very imaginative things will have to happen, and Israel will have to reconfigure what its future is as a state in the part of the world in which it lives, and how it's going to cope with what essentially has become a total disaster and mess in the region that now looks very different than it looked 3 years ago when this conflict started. I think if you now turn the clock back to how this all started, you will recall that masses of Hamas people went over the border and killed, I think, over 1,000 Israelis, and it was shocking and it was horrible, and that led to the beginnings of the current conflict. So from Israel's point of view, or from Israelis' point of view, obviously Israel needed to respond, and they are still suffering from the deaths of their fellow Israelis in the hands of Hamas. Now, the question is sort of two-pronged here. Can Hamas, in any kind of future configuration, be disarmed, and can they become part of some governing structure? That is a complicated question beyond, the 30 minutes we have today, but certainly some thinking has to go into it, especially if Hamas is willing to disarm it down the road. The other thing is that Israel, has a lot of sympathy from the world about what happened to the Israelis when Hamas came over the border. The sad thing about that is, there are many sad things about it, is that it didn't need to happen. That is to say, Hamas was interested in invading Israel and killing Israelis. But that it was in the process of happening was actually known, because the soldiers who were watching the border between Israel and Gaza saw the marching of and the movement of military equipment towards Israel, and they reported it. They were women soldiers, by the way, who were the lookout soldiers. They reported it to the government, and the government decided not to react. And historically, when this is all being revisited, that is also an interesting question. Why did the government decide to ignore the very watchdog soldiers that were staying on the border? And had the government of Israel reacted at that particular time, how would this have all unspooled? We don't know the answer to that. That's conjectural. But it's an interesting historical artifact which needs to be looked at. Moving back to the West Bank for a minute, Israel is managing West Bank affairs through the auspices of the two most right-wing members of the council, the management of Israel policies, the cabinet, so to speak. And they are very gung-ho for the settlers to take over as much as of the West Bank as possible. And the question is, what is the West Bank government doing? And the West Bank government, meaning the Palestinian West Bank government, is essentially moribund, right? Its leaders is in his early 90s, almost not functioning. So the governing structure, which might have responded and be able to stop this movement of the settler population into more and more areas in the West Bank, is also not happening. So in that sense, a plague on both your houses. That is to say, the Palestinians' governing structure was not competent and able to stop this. But the net result is that you have in the West Bank less and less territory, less and less, fewer and fewer olive farms, less and less capability as the settler population, with the support of the Israeli military and two of the ministers of Netanyahu's cabinet, keep saying, go folks, go take it over. In the meantime, what is the human dimension in both places? Well, the human dimension of the 2 million Gazans is of course, that everybody has lost family members, more or less. Everybody has lost their houses, more or less. Everybody has members of the family who've gotten killed. Everybody is disoriented and in psychological disarray. And since the proportion of the population is fairly large in terms of children, these children are all, in some senses, harmed for life, right? Even if they're physically surviving this. One knows this from other wars, Vietnam, World War II, etc. Children who've experienced nothing but warfare, a hardship, living in tents, no sanitation, no schooling, etc., are not going to be these nice, stable adults that will be easy to govern by any government. Likewise, in the West Bank, what has happened to many of the Palestinians, even before the current chasing of more and more Palestinians out of their villages, was that thousands of Palestinians have been imprisoned for years. And we know something about, by the Israelis, so it's Israeli prisons. We know something about that situation because some people have come out of prison. Notably, you might have heard him on the news, a Palestinian journalist who reported that he lost about 40% of his body weight, that his beatings broke several, of his bones, that the food situation in this Israeli prison is a nightmare. So even if at some point these thousands of people in the prisoners in the West Bank, of teenagers, young adults, and as well as adults like this journalist ever come out, these are also people in psychological and physical disarray. So the future, it seems to me, in terms of how to fix any of this, if anybody wanted to fix it, and what the future of Israel is going to be in the Middle East, and how the Israeli state can reconfigure itself in some version that is workable in the future. Now, the Netanyahu government is the last leader and the last government to deal with this, right? And Netanyahu's, Israelis' view of Netanyahu are not dissimilar in terms of makeup to Americans' views about Trump. Many Israelis detest Netanyahu, wish for a better government, wish that he would and his cabinet would go away in the next election, but it doesn't seem that they will, probably. But even if they did, the next generation of any kind of leadership in Israel will be stuck with a situation as I described. And even if they think more creatively about a long-term solution for what has happened to this historic Palestinian then Israeli state in the region. This will be a monumental task. And it is unclear who would be in charge if Netanyahu goes, probably not in this election, but down the line. In the meantime, the world, including the United States, has a lot to answer for. The support of Israel is both historical and emotional. The idea of a state of Israel in this Palestinian region is historical. After the First World War, the idea was that the English colonizers was that Israelis would get a state. And certainly after the Holocaust and what happened in Europe, there was a lot of sympathy for the development of an Israeli state in 1947-48 when Israel came into being, which in part explains why much of the funding for the development of the state of Israel was Western and largely American funding. Everybody wished the state well. And the support, the financial support and military support on the part of the United States was huge. Since 1948, the largest proportion of the American military budget for overseas activity has always gone to Israel. And Israel is, in some senses today, a remarkable state, because what was, a rural area with kibbutzes and all the rest has been morphed into a remarkable modern state to be admired for its accomplishment, its modernity, its capacity, and all the rest in a technological and economic sense. On the other hand, the politics of it all have increasingly not only continued to be a nightmare, but are unresolvable, so to speak. Now, one of the many problems of people weighing in heavily, against the Netanyahu regime, which is in some ways responsible for the degree to which the situation exists nowadays, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, is that everybody wants to be charitable to Israel. And as you know, both in the United States and elsewhere, the criticism of Israel and its current conflicts in Gaza and the West Bank and so forth, whenever they're offered criticism, there's always the argument, well, you're just being anti-Semitic. And I think one has to get used to the fact that, yes, anti-Semitism has existed in the past and exists today in the world, in the United States. But many people who are Jewish, many people who are not Jewish, but not the least bit anti-Semitic, look at this situation of Israel, its policies, what has happened in that part of the world, both with shock and dismay as to how a democratic state like Israel, admittedly living in a very hostile environment, can nevertheless let things get out of control as much as it has. And it must also be said that all these neighboring states of Israel are not necessarily or have not necessarily been hostile in recent years. Egypt, for example, Saudi Arabia, any number of states were willing and maybe softly speaking, but nevertheless willing to accept that Israel was an important state in the region, and were primarily concerned about the fate of the Palestinians. Now you flip it around, of course, and saying, well, this whole conflict is all caused by Hezbollah and, by Hamas and the influence of Iran and all the rest of it. But as I've tried to point out, Israel has lived in a bad neighborhood, but it's not helping itself to perpetuate the bad neighborhood. And in fact, one of the unnoticed, or at least little discussed, issue was that as bad as Hamas is, I mean, they're a terrorist organization, the origins of Hamas, when Hamas was this little organization hanging out in the Gulf states, Israel actually funded Hamas in the early days because they thought it would be a good opposition and would prevent, the kind of push for an independent state and all the rest of it. So the history of all of this is both complex and sordid. And the question, of course, arises, now what? And I think that if the Board of Peace somehow thinks that this genie can be put back in the bottle and they can now make peace between Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, and we'll go back to square one. You can't go back to square one historically. What does have a lot of sympathy is a terrorist organization like Hamas. That is to say, the taking away of military capacity from Hamas, as everybody agrees, is a good idea. I mean, supporting the Gazans and the West Bankers, Palestinians, does not mean one supports Hamas or other terrorist organization. So how to cope with this terrorist organization and how to take away their weapons and, in a sense, defang them is a problem that is high on the agenda for this peace commission, and the the international community, one way or another. Can Hamas be defanged? Can terrorist organizations be put down? Not in the presence of such injustice and horror, when people who are actually opposed to the Hamas, most Gazans are not fans of Hamas, cannot comfortably say that the terrorist organization in their midst is no longer dangerous. So there are many bits and pieces of this, and this is quite complicated. And I think that it is very difficult not only to be either Palestinians in either part. I think a two-state solution, if I just could repeat it and summarize, is dead. What you put in its place not only depends on the international community, but really does depend to what extent the population of Israel can get rid of its current government and more sensible future plans can be put into place. One should finally say that Israelis themselves are very torn. It's just like, the right wing in the United States who are all pro-Trump, let's say. There are certainly a chunk of Israelis who are Netanyahu and who support these right-wing ministers helping to take over the West Bank, etc. But there is a large component as well in Israel of Israelis who are horrified at their own government and what their own government has wrought, even though, of course, they justifiably mourn the death of their fellow citizens when Hamas came and killed them. So it's difficult to be an Israeli right now. And it's difficult, I think, for the world to look on to what's happening and to not see an easy solution. And certainly Trump now jumping in and saying, oh, I can fix this all, is delusional. Thank you for listening, and see you in September.